Some songs don't get a fair shot the first time around. They get ignored, buried, mislabeled, or simply released at the wrong moment into a world that wasn't quite ready for them. Then, sometimes, years later, something shifts. A movie, a DJ, a producer with a gut feeling, and suddenly the same song that nobody wanted is everywhere. These are 15 songs from the 1960s that flopped, then suddenly hit number 1. Number 15, The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
In October 1964, Simon and Garfunkel released their debut album Wednesday morning, 3 a.m. on Columbia Records. It sold roughly 3,000 copies. That's not a slow start, that's a non-start. The duo split up shortly after. Paul Simon moved to England to perform in folk clubs. Art Garfunkel went back to college. What neither of them knew was that a late-night DJ at WBZ in Boston had quietly started spinning The Sound of Silence off that forgotten album. College students along the East Coast started responding. The song traveled south all the way to Florida during spring break season, and the response was unmistakable wherever it played. Columbia producer Tom Wilson, who had recently added electric instruments to Bob Dylan's folk recordings, decided to do the same thing to The Sound of Silence without telling the duo. He brought in session musicians, overdubbed electric guitar, bass, and drums onto the original acoustic track, and quietly re-released it as a single in September 1965. Simon learned the song had charted while he was backstage at a club in Copenhagen, preparing to go on. He flew back to the United States. Garfunkel came back from his studies, and by New Year's Day, 1966, The Sound of Silence was sitting at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The band that had broken up had their first number 1 hit, without having been in the same room when it was made.
In the wells of silence.
Number 14, What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong.
I see trees of green.
By 1967, Louis Armstrong had already had a remarkable career spanning decades. He had topped the Billboard Hot 100 just 3 years earlier with Hello, Dolly, actually knocking the Beatles out of the top spot, which is a sentence worth reading twice. But What a Wonderful World was a different kind of song, and it found a different kind of resistance. Songwriters Bob Thiele and George David Weiss wrote it specifically for Armstrong, hoping his warmth and crossover appeal could carry a message of racial harmony during a period of extreme social tension in America. They recorded it in Las Vegas after one of his shows, the session running until nearly 6 in the morning. Larry Newton, president of ABC Records, hated the song. He thought it was too slow, too sentimental, not the upbeat follow-up he wanted. He flew to Nevada to try to stop the recording. According to accounts from those present, he was locked out of the studio. Newton's revenge was to simply not promote the record. It sold fewer than 1,000 copies in the United States. Across the Atlantic, it was a completely different story. In the UK, What a Wonderful World climbed to number 1 and became the biggest selling single of 1968. Armstrong never got to see its American redemption. He passed away in 1971. It wasn't until his recording was featured in the 1987 Robin Williams film, Good Morning Vietnam, that U.S. audiences finally embraced it, sending it back up the charts and into permanent cultural memory. Armstrong himself had said of the song, "All I'm saying is, see what a wonderful world it would be if only we'd give it a chance."
What a wonderful world.
Number 13, Time of the Season by The Zombies.
When love runs high.
The Zombies had already scored a number 1 hit in 1964 with She's Not There, but by 1967, the band was running out of momentum and running out of money. They recorded Odessey and Oracle, the album title misspelled on the cover by the designer, at Abbey Road Studios, largely on their own dime, knowing it might be their last. They were right. The album was released in the spring of 1968 to lukewarm reviews, and Clive Davis, head of CBS in the US, blocked its American release. The Zombies broke up, they were done. Then Al Kooper, the session musician who had played organ on Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone and was now working as a CBS staff producer, discovered the album during a trip to London. He lobbied Davis hard until the label agreed to release it in America. Several singles flopped. Cooper kept pushing for one more. Time of the Season was finally released as a single in late 1968, more than a year after the band had recorded it and months after they had broken up. It took until early 1969 to find its audience, but when it did, it went to number 1 on the Cashbox chart and number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Zombies, who no longer existed as a functioning band, had their biggest American hit. Rod Argent later reflected, "Time of the Season was number 1 in most countries in the world, but we weren't even together when it happened." Number 12, Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers. In 1965, Phil Spector was running Phillies Records and was not particularly interested in producing B-sides. So when it came time to record the B-side for the Righteous Brothers' single Hung on You, he handed the job to Bill Medley. Medley produced what he thought was a solid album track. Bobby Hatfield singing a classic ballad from a 1955 prison film, a song that had already been a hit for Les Baxter and Al Hibbler a decade earlier. Spector put Unchained Melody on the B-side and gave Hung on You all the promotion. Radio DJs ignored the A-side and flipped the record. Hung on You got nowhere. Unchained Melody became an enormous hit, reaching number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1965. Spector was reportedly furious about the DJs ignoring his designated A-side. Medley later laughed about it. "If I knew it was going to be a hit, I certainly would have brought in a better piano player." The song hit even harder a quarter-century later when it was featured in the pottery wheel scene of the 1990 film Ghost. That film sent it back up the charts internationally, giving the Righteous Brothers a song that had been born as throwaway filler a second life as one of the most recognizable love songs in recorded history. Number 11, Respect by Otis Redding, then number 1 by Aretha Franklin. Do me wrong, you want it. Otis Redding wrote and first recorded Respect in 1965 for Stax Records. It was a modest hit, reaching number 35 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was a good song, but it wasn't a landmark. Redding performed it live, kept it in his repertoire, and moved on. Then Aretha Franklin recorded her own version in 1967 for Atlantic Records. She took Redding's composition, rearranged it, gave it new urgency, added the famous spelling out of the title in the chorus, and transformed it into something that resonated far beyond pop radio. At a moment when civil rights tensions were boiling over in cities across the country, Franklin's version became an anthem for women, for Black Americans, and for anyone who felt their dignity was being overlooked. Redding's original had stalled at 35. Franklin's version went straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in June 1967, where it stayed for 2 weeks. Otis Redding, to his credit, was gracious about it. He reportedly told friends afterward that Aretha had taken his song away from him, and he meant it as the highest compliment. Number 10, Stand By Me by Benny King.
When the night has come.
Benny King wrote Stand By Me for the Drifters. they passed on it. He recorded it himself in 1961, and it performed reasonably well, peaking at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 and hitting number 1 on the R&B chart. Not a flop by any measure, but in the UK, it barely made a dent, peaking at number 27 on its original release. 25 years later, director Rob Reiner was making a film adaptation of a Stephen King novella. The movie was originally going to be called The Body, after the story it was based on. Reiner heard Stand By Me at his house one day and felt it perfectly captured the spirit of the film. The friendship, the memory, the sense of something passing. He renamed the movie. The 1986 film was a hit, and the song came roaring back with it. Stand By Me reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 on its re-release and hit number 1 on the UK singles chart in early 1987, 26 years after it was originally recorded. There are not many songs that can claim a number 1 hit in 2 different decades.
Oh, stand by me.
Number 9, House of the Rising Sun by The Animals.
There is a house in New Orleans.
The House of the Rising Sun is a traditional American folk song with roots going back to at least the 1930s. It had been recorded by multiple artists, including an early version by Bob Dylan on his 1962 debut album. Dylan's version introduced it to the British folk scene, where a young Eric Burdon and the Animals picked it up. The Animals recorded their version in a single take in May 1964 in about 15 minutes. They had almost no budget for studio time, so there was no second attempt. Lead singer Eric Burdon poured everything into that one take. Producer Mickey Most was on the clock. Columbia Records initially didn't want to release it as a single because of its length. At 4.5 minutes, it was nearly twice the standard pop single length of the era, and radio stations were reluctant to give it airplay. The label was talked into releasing it anyway, and by July 1964, it had hit number 1 in the UK. 2 months later, it was number 1 in the United States as well, making it one of the defining records of the British invasion. The song Eric Burdon laid down in one desperate 15-minute studio session went on to be inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1999. Number 8, God Only Knows by the Beach Boys.
I may not always love you.
Brian Wilson spent months crafting Pet Sounds in 1966. Widely regarded now as one of the greatest albums ever recorded. Capitol Records hated it. They thought it was too unconventional, too complex, too far from the surf pop they expected from the Beach Boys. They didn't know what to do with it. God Only Knows, the album's centerpiece ballad sung by Carl Wilson, was released as a single in the US in the summer of 1966. It peaked at number 39 on the Billboard Hot 100. Radio programmers were reluctant because the song opened with the words, "I may not always love you," which struck some stations as oddly pessimistic for a love song. In the UK, where the album was promoted more enthusiastically, it performed far better, reaching number 2 on the UK singles chart. Paul McCartney later called it the greatest song ever written, which he has said publicly on multiple occasions. Despite never cracking the US Top 40 on its original release, God Only Knows has spent the following decades being recognized as one of the most harmonically sophisticated and emotionally true pop recordings of the entire decade.
You'll never need to doubt it.
Number 7, People Get Ready by The Impressions.
I believe, yeah.
Curtis Mayfield wrote People Get Ready in 1965, inspired in part by the civil rights marches he had witnessed. The Impressions released it that year on ABC Paramount Records. It reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart. a genuine hit, though perhaps not the cultural landmark it would become. Its true elevation happened slowly, over decades. The song was covered hundreds of times. Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck released a version in 1985 that reached #1 in the UK. Mayfield himself said he considered it his most important composition. A hymn, really, more than a pop song. In 2004, Rolling Stone ranked it at number 24 on its list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. Its second chart life came from its use in films, commercials, and ceremonial moments across multiple decades, proving that some songs don't need a comeback so much as they need time for the world to understand what they were trying to say. Number 6, A Change Is Gonna Come by Sam Cooke.
I was born by the river.
Sam Cooke recorded A Change Is Gonna Come in late 1963 and released it in December 1964, just weeks after his tragic death. It reached number 9 on the R&B chart and number 31 on the Billboard Hot 100. A modest performance for an artist of Cooke's stature. The song was seen as too political for mainstream pop radio, too slow for R&B stations. What it was a song ahead of its moment. Cooke had been inspired partly by Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind and partly by his own experiences with racial discrimination, being turned away from a Louisiana motel in 1963 with his family after being refused a room. He wrote the song in response to that indignity and others like it. Over the following decades, A Change Is Gonna Come became one of the most frequently cited songs of the civil rights era. It has been performed at presidential inaugurations, funerals of movement leaders, and major cultural moments. Rolling Stone ranked it at number 12 on its 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list. By the time it received that recognition, Sam Cooke had been gone for 40 years. Number 5, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers. When Phil Spector, Barry Mann, and Cynthia Weil finished writing You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' in 1964, Spector was so convinced of its potential that he poured an extraordinary production budget into it. British radio's initial reaction was to balk at the song's length. At 3 minutes and 45 seconds, it was one of the longest pop singles released to that point. Some UK stations trimmed it or skipped it entirely. On its US release in late 1964, it didn't immediately explode. Radio director Bill Gavin famously said the intro was too slow and the song too long to be a hit. He was wrong. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' climbed steadily and hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in February 1965, where it stayed for 2 weeks. It topped the UK charts as well. BMI has since certified it as the most performed song in the history of American radio and television, over 8 million broadcasts. That's the song the radio director said was too slow to be a hit. Number 4, Sittin' On the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding.
Oh, I'm just gonna sit on the dock of the bay.
Otis Redding wrote and recorded Dock of the Bay in November and December of 1967. He was killed in a plane crash on December 10th, just 3 days after the final recording session. The song was released posthumously in January 1968. At the time, nothing about Dock of the Bay fit the standard Stax Records mold. It was quieter, more introspective than the driving soul records Redding was known for. There were whistling sections. There was a fading outro of waves and seagulls. Label co-founder Jim Stewart reportedly told Redding he thought the song was too pop, too soft for his audience. Redding had a feeling about it anyway. He told producer Steve Cropper in those final sessions that he thought it would be a hit. He was right, though he never got to know it. Sittin' On. The Dock of the Bay became the first posthumous number 1 single in the history of the Billboard Hot 100. sitting at the top for 4 weeks in the spring of 1968. It remains one of the most quietly devastating recordings in soul music history. Number 3, Light My Fire by The Doors.
You know that I would be a liar.
When The Doors recorded Light My Fire for their debut album in 1967, they played the full-length album version at over 7 minutes. Elektra Records wanted to release it as a single, but 7 minutes of psychedelic rock was never going to get AM radio airplay in 1967. The label told the band to cut it down. The band was reluctant. Jim Morrison and keyboardist Ray Manzarek particularly valued the extended instrumental sections, but they eventually agreed to an edited version of around 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Elektra released it in April 1967. Initial radio response was slow. Program directors weren't sure what to make of it. Then the song found its audience. By July 1967, Light My Fire had climbed to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, where it stayed for 3 weeks. It made The Doors one of the defining acts of that summer and launched Morrison into a level of cultural visibility that would follow him and haunt him for the rest of his short life. The full 7-minute album version, meanwhile, became a staple of FM radio and college dorms for decades. Number 2, Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. John Fogerty wrote Fortunate Son in 1969 as an act of frustration, specifically at the sight of wealthy, well-connected young men avoiding military service in Vietnam while working-class kids shipped out. He reportedly wrote the entire lyric in about 20 minutes at the kitchen table. Fogerty later recalled that the song felt almost automatic, like it was already written, and he just had to find the words for it. Fantasy Records released it as the B-side of Down on the Corner in November 1969. Radio stations played the B-side instead. Fortunate Son peaked at number 14 on the Billboard Hot 100, a decent showing, but not a chart topper. Its real life began over the following decades as it became permanently embedded in documentary films, war movies, and the cultural memory of the Vietnam era. It has appeared in more films set in the Vietnam period than almost any other song. Rolling Stone ranked it among the greatest rock songs ever recorded. It is one of those cases where the chart position turned out to be almost entirely beside the point. Number 1, Mr. Tambourine Man by The Byrds. Bob Dylan recorded Mr. Tambourine Man acoustically in 1964, and it appeared on his album Bringing It All Back Home in early 1965. As a Dylan recording, it was respected but didn't chart as a single in the US. The song's lyrical density and unusual structure made it a challenging commercial proposition. Then the Byrds got hold of it. They recorded an electrified, harmonically rich version that stripped Dylan's multi-verse original down to a single verse, added jangly 12-string Rickenbacker guitar, and produced something that felt entirely new. Columbia Records released it in April 1965. Program directors were skeptical. Several didn't know what to call it. It wasn't straight rock, it wasn't folk, it wasn't pop in any conventional sense, but listeners knew exactly what it was. By June 1965, Mr. Tambourine Man was number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It also topped the UK charts. It became the defining record of the folk rock movement, influencing an entire generation of artists. And it launched the Byrds from a promising new band into one of the most important acts of the decade. Dylan's original was the seed. The Byrds version was what grew from it. 50, 60 years later, and these songs are still doing exactly what they were always meant to do. They outlasted the executives who doubted them, the radio directors who wouldn't play them, and the moment in time when nobody was listening. That's what the good ones do. If you remembered some of these, or heard a story here you'd never come across before, drop it in the comments. It's always good to know who else has been paying attention. And if you'd like to keep hearing about the stories behind the songs that shaped the decade, hit the like button and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.